On the night of the 14th of April, in the year 1912, the largest moving object ever built by human hands slipped quietly across the North Atlantic. The sea was flat. It was so still that the water looked less like an ocean and more like a sheet of black glass. There was no moon. The stars came all the way down to the horizon in every direction, and they doubled themselves in the calm below. The air had turned bitterly cold. A few hours earlier, it had been mild enough to walk the open decks. Now the temperature fell away degree by degree. It was the kind of cold that means open water and clear skies, and nothing at all between you and the depth of space above. On the bridge, the officers looked out at a sea with no waves in it. That should have been a comfort. A calm sea feels like a safe sea, but a flat sea breaks no white water against anything floating in its path, and that small absence would come to matter more than anyone on watch could have known. High in the crow's nest, two lookouts felt the cold too. It had a stillness that pressed against the skin and made the eyes water. There was no wind to carry sound. The ship moved through the dark, almost without noise, a lit thing crossing a sleeping sea, leaving a long pale wake that closed behind her and was gone. Aboard the ship were more than 2,000 people. Most of them were asleep. Some were finishing late conversations in the warm light of the smoking rooms. A few lay awake in their cabins, listening to the steady hum of the engines turning far below the floor. None of them knew that this was the last night many of them would ever live. Tonight we are not here for the iceberg. We are not going to study the rivets or the bulkheads or the long argument about who was to blame. Tonight we are going to spend the last few hours with the people. The stewards and the millionaires, the mothers and the firemen, the man who would dress in his finest clothes so that he could die well, the musicians who chose to keep playing while the deck slid slowly out from under them. This is the story of a floating town of strangers, carried across the most famous stretch of dark water in all of human history. It is slow, it is quiet. Almost every moment of it happened in the cold and in the dark, far from any help, under a sky crowded with stars. We know how the night ends. That is the strange weight this story carries. We know the ship goes down. The people on her decks did not know it, not for a long time, and the distance between what they believed and what was coming is the whole of the story we are about to enter. If you find this slow, quiet exploration of mystery something you genuinely enjoy, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe. Letting me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you is always a quiet comfort. Now find your comfortable position. Dim the lights. Take a slow breath. We are leaving the map behind. To understand the people, we first have to understand the world they were standing inside. Because for the men and women who walked her decks, the ship did not feel like a ship at all. She felt like a place, a solid place built to last, the kind of place you do not question. She was longer than any building most of her passengers had ever entered. Her funnels rose so high above the boat deck that a person standing at the rail had to lean back to see the tops of them. Inside, there were warm rooms panelled in dark wood. There were electric lights in every passage. There was a grand staircase that fell through several decks beneath a dome of iron and glass, and at the bottom of it stood a carved clock that kept the ship's time. There were dining rooms with white linen and fresh flowers, There was a swimming bath, and a gymnasium with strange mechanical horses, and a cafe where painted palm leaves brushed the windows. There were reading rooms and a barber shop, and a dark room for the photographs people took of their grand crossing. Far below all of that were rooms most passengers would never see. In them, men shoveled coal into furnaces the size of small rooms. They worked in heat that left them soaked, and they kept the whole floating town alive. It was a town with classes, laid out from top to bottom. The wealthy lived high and forward in wide staterooms. Families of more modest means lived lower and nearer the stern, in tidy cabins close to the steerage decks. Hundreds of others had crossed an ocean to reach this ship at all, carrying everything they owned toward a new life on the far side of the water. And almost everyone aboard shared one quiet belief. They believed the ship beneath their feet could not sink. No one had ever quite promised that, but the idea had settled into the air around her, in the newspapers and the talk on the docks, in the sheer size of the thing. She had a double bottom. She had compartments that could be sealed off behind heavy doors. People said she was practically unsinkable, and they said it lightly, the way you say a thing you have never once had reason to doubt. That belief is the floor this whole story rests on. It is why the warning came so slowly. It is why so many would not leave when they were asked. When you are standing inside what you believe to be the safest ship ever built, the idea that you should climb into a small wooden boat and be lowered toward a freezing sea sounds less like rescue and more like madness. We carry maps like that all the time. We build something large and we decide it is permanent. We trust the floor because it has never given way. The people on this ship were not foolish. They simply believed what every signal around them told them to believe. The sea outside did not share that belief. The sea does not care what we build, or how large, or how clever. It was out there in the dark that night, flat and cold and patient, and it had all the time in the world. For now, though, the lights were warm and the band had finished for the evening, and the ship moved on through the calm. Inside, it was easy to forget there was an ocean at all. Most of us think we already know this night. It has been told so many times that it has worn a smooth shape in our minds. A great ship, a wall of ice in the dark, a tilting deck and a sad song, and a slow descent into the sea. We picture it almost as a single image, lit and framed, already finished. But that picture, like the belief in the unsinkable ship, is not quite the truth. The real night was slower than the picture. It was quieter. It was far more confusing for the people inside it, because they did not have the ending the way we do. They had only the next minute, and then the next, each one arriving without warning. There was no music swelling to tell them how to feel. There was no narrator explaining what was happening below the waterline. There was a calm and ordinary evening that simply did not stop being calm and ordinary, even after the thing that doomed them had already happened. For more than an hour after the ship was fatally wounded, much of the deck carried on almost as before. People stood about in the cold making small jokes. Some went back to bed. A steward later remembered passengers who were annoyed at being woken, who asked whether all this fuss was truly necessary. The catastrophe was already certain. The people simply could not see it yet. That gap is the heart of what we tend to miss. We imagine panic from the first moment, because we know what they did not. But terror needs belief, and belief came slowly to a ship that everyone had been told could not sink. The fear, when it finally arrived, did not arrive all at once. It crept up deck by deck, cabin by cabin, as the angle of the floor changed beneath their feet, and the truth became impossible to argue with. And the people themselves were not the characters we have made of them. They were strangers to one another. 2,000 separate lives, each with its own reason for being on the water that week. A honeymoon, a funeral to attend, a new job, a sick mother, a fresh start in a country they had never seen. Some were returning home after years away. Some were chasing money or love, or simply the next thing their life was meant to hold. A ship that size could carry an entire society at once, from the very rich in their private promenades to families who had sold nearly everything they owned to afford a bunk in the lowest cabins. They shared the same hull. They did not share the same odds. There was a couple who had been married for more than 40 years and could not imagine being parted. There was a man traveling with his 2 small sons under a false name, fleeing a marriage that had broken. There were children asleep in steerage who would never learn how close the boats had been. None of them were thinking about history. They were thinking about tomorrow, and the day after, and the ordinary futures they assumed they still had. So set the familiar image gently aside. The night we are about to enter is not a film. It is colder than that, and slower, and far more human. It is full of people making small choices in the dark, with no idea that those choices would be remembered for more than 100 years. To stand with them, we have to go back to the one moment when their ordinary night ended. It came without a crash. It came as something most of them barely felt at all. High above the bridge, in a small steel basket, near the top of the forward mast, 2 men stood watch. The crow's nest was an exposed and lonely post on a night like this. The cold pressed in from every side. The men had no binoculars, because the glasses had gone missing somewhere between pours, and so they searched the dark with nothing but their own eyes. There was a problem with the dark that night, and it was the same flat calm that had felt so peaceful from the decks below. With no waves at all, there was no white water breaking anywhere. An iceberg in the open sea usually betrays itself by the ring of foam that gathers at its base. On a mirror sea, there is no foam. There is only a darker shape against a dark horizon, and you do not see it until it is already close. At about 11:40 in the evening, one of the lookouts saw it. A mass rose out of the blackness directly ahead, taller than the forecastle deck, blacker than the night around it. He rang the bell above him 3 times. He lifted the telephone to the bridge and said the words that men in his position were trained to say. "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge there was a sudden flurry of orders. The wheel was turned hard. The engines were called to reverse. The ship began to swing slowly, the way something that long and heavy must always turn. For a few held seconds, it looked as though she might clear it. The bow inched away from the dark shape rising in front of her. She almost made it. That is one of the cruelest details in the whole night. A few seconds earlier, a slightly harder turn, and the berg might have passed by in the dark and been forgotten by morning. Instead, the ship slid alongside it, and below the waterline, where no passenger could see, the ice did its quiet work. There was no great crash. People expecting a story of collision are always surprised by this. There was no shattering sound, no violent blow that threw people from their feet. What most of them felt was a faint tremor, a shudder, a grinding sensation that came up through the soles of their shoes and was gone almost as soon as it arrived. Some felt nothing at all and slept straight through it. Others thought a propeller blade had been thrown, or that the ship had dropped anchor, or that they had brushed against something small in the night. A few who were awake on deck saw the dark mountain of ice slide past, close enough to touch, shedding small chunks onto the forward well deck as it went. Children later played with the ice. Men carried pieces into the smoking room as a joke. No one understood yet that the ice had not simply brushed them. Below the waterline, it had opened a long and narrow wound, springing the seams of the hull along several compartments at once. The damage was not a single hole anyone could picture. It was a row of small gaps, low and forward, and through every one of them the cold sea was already pressing in. And then the berg was behind them, swallowed again by the dark, and the sea was calm and the stars were out, and to almost everyone aboard it seemed that nothing of importance had happened at all, but something had. Far below their feet, in the parts of the ship the passengers never thought about, the sea had already begun to come in. The strange thing about that moment is how differently it reached each person on the ship. The same event arrived as 100 separate small sensations, and where you were standing decided what you would remember for the rest of your life. High up in the first-class staterooms, many felt almost nothing. A faint quiver in a wine glass, a slight check in the steady rhythm of the engines. One woman said it was no more than the shiver of a train slowing into a station. Several rolled over and went back to sleep, certain that whatever it was had nothing to do with them. Up on the open deck, a few late risers leaned at the rail and felt only the cold. The stars were enormous above them. The sea was black glass below. Whatever had happened seemed to belong to some other ship entirely, far from the warm and lit world that they had been living inside for days. Lower down, the sensation was sharper. Passengers in the middle decks felt a definite jar, a sense of the whole great structure flinching. Some heard a long tearing sound, like cloth being ripped slowly, or a heavy chain being dragged along the outside of the hull. But it was at the very bottom of the ship, down where the steel met the sea, that the moment was unmistakable. There the sound was not faint, and the shudder was not gentle. It was a deep grinding roar that filled the forward compartments, and with it came something far worse than noise. Cold water, under enormous pressure, beginning to find its way in. For a few minutes a kind of stillness settled over the upper ship. The engines, which had thrummed steadily for days, went quiet. That silence woke more people than the impact had. The hum had become the heartbeat of the place, so constant that no one noticed it until it stopped. When it stopped, the quiet itself felt wrong. People began to stir. Doors opened along the passages. Passengers in dressing gowns stepped out and asked one another what had happened, and no one had an answer. A few climbed the stairs to the open decks to see for themselves, and found only the cold and the stars and the bits of ice scattered on the forward deck. There was at first no fear. There was curiosity and a little irritation, and the ordinary social awkwardness of strangers standing about in their nightclothes. Men lit cigarettes. Someone wondered aloud whether they would be delayed reaching New York. The whole scene had the feeling of a minor inconvenience, a story to tell at breakfast. Up on the bridge, the mood was very different. The officers had felt the impact for what it was, and they knew the ship had struck ice along her side. Word was sent down for the ship's designer to be found and brought up. He had built her. He would know, better than anyone alive, exactly what she could survive. While the passengers traded sleepy questions in the warm passages above, a small group of men was already descending into the cold and rising water below. They carried lamps. They went down to learn the truth. What they found in those flooding compartments would decide the fate of everyone on board, and the truth they carried back up the stairs was worse than anyone standing on the bright decks could have begun to imagine. Down at the bottom of the ship was a world the passengers never thought about. It had its own people, hundreds of them working through the night, so that the bright decks above could stay warm and lit and moving. They were the firemen and the stokers and the trimmers. Their work was to feed coal into the furnaces, hour after hour, in heat that left them soaked and blackened. They lived close to the waterline, in quarters far forward in the bow. When the ice opened the side of the ship, they were among the very first human beings on Earth to know that something terrible had happened, because the sea came to them first. In one of the forward boiler rooms, men were standing at their posts when the side of the ship seemed to give a great shudder. Then a wall of cold water burst in through a gash in the hull, knocking some of them off their feet, rising fast around their boots. They scrambled for the watertight doors as the alarm sounded. Some made it through before the heavy doors came down. The water followed them, patient and relentless, room by room. In the mail room, low and forward, the clerks were already fighting a losing battle. The sea was climbing the stairs there, swallowing the sacks of letters 2,000 families were waiting to receive. The clerks tried to carry the mail higher, up out of the rising water, as if the letters still mattered more than their own lives. The water did not slow for them. Steam hissed somewhere in the dark. Lamps swung on their hooks and threw long shadows across the wet steel. These were men who knew the ship from the inside out, who had lived in her lowest spaces for the whole crossing. They understood at once that no pump on earth could hold back what was coming in. This is where the ship's designer went, with the captain at his side, to read the wound. He understood the ship better than any living person. He knew how she was divided, how many of her forward compartments could flood before the water would spill over the tops of the walls between them and pull the bow down. He did the arithmetic in his head as he walked through the flooding spaces. The ship could float with some of her forward compartments open to the sea. She could not float with all of them open. And as he watched the water climbing, he understood that too many had been torn at once. The sea would rise compartment by compartment, tipping the bow lower, until it poured over each wall in turn, like water filling an ice cube tray, held at an angle. There was no doubt in the answer, and no comfort in it. He told the captain plainly, the ship would sink. It was not a question of whether, only of how long, and the time he gave was cruelly short. Perhaps an hour, perhaps a little more. Take a moment with that. Somewhere above them, more than 2,000 people stood about in the warm light. They were mildly curious and faintly annoyed, and certain the ship was safe. And down in the cold, two men now carried a piece of knowledge that none of those people had. There were not enough boats for half of them. The men above did not know they were already counting their last minutes. The men below had just discovered it. The order went out quietly at first, passed from steward to steward along the warm passages. Wake the passengers, get them dressed, put them in their lifebelts, and bring them up to the boat deck. Do it calmly. Do not frighten them. What followed was one of the strangest hours in the whole night. The crew knew the ship was dying. The passengers did not. And so, the warning had to travel across an enormous gap of belief. From people who had seen the water rising, to people who had felt nothing more than a shiver in a glass. Imagine being woken in the small hours by a knock at your cabin door. A steward stands in the passage, polite and steady, asking you to put on something warm and a lifebelt, and to come up to the deck. Outside your window the night is calm. The floor beneath you is level. The lights are burning. Everything your senses tell you says the ship is fine. And a man in a uniform is asking you to leave its warmth for the freezing dark above. Most people did not believe it. Why would they? They had been told this ship could not sink, and nothing they could see contradicted that. Many took their time. They dressed carefully. Some chose their better clothes. A few decided the whole thing was a precaution and went back to bed once the steward had moved on down the corridor. There was a quiet, awful politeness to it all. People apologized for the inconvenience. They asked whether they really needed the bulky lifebelts, which were uncomfortable and difficult to fasten over warm coats. On the grand staircase, passengers gathered in their belts and evening clothes, and waited to be told what to do, as though this were one more event the ship had arranged for them. Down in the lower decks, the experience was different and harder. Families in steerage were further from the boats, separated from them by a maze of passages and stairways and gates they did not know how to cross. Many spoke little English. The instructions that reached the upper decks reached them late, or not at all. Some gathered their children and waited where they were told. Some prayed. Some began slowly to understand that no one was coming to guide them up. Stewards moved along the lower passages, knocking on doors and calling people toward the boats. But the way up wound through unfamiliar corridors and steep iron stairs. For people who had never been above their own deck, the ship became a maze in the dark. Precious minutes were lost, simply finding the way toward the cold air and the light. The terrible truth was that disbelief was the most natural response in the world. The mind protects itself. It does not leap straight to catastrophe. It looks for the ordinary explanation first and clings to it, because the ordinary explanation lets you keep your warm bed and your sense that the world is as solid as it was an hour ago. But the floor was not as solid as it had been. Slowly, so slowly that at first only the most attentive noticed, the angle of the ship was beginning to change. The bow was settling. The long decks were tilting, by a fraction of a degree at a time, toward the black water ahead. And up on the boat deck, the crew had begun to uncover the lifeboats and to confront an arithmetic that could not be made to work. Here is the hard fact at the center of the night, the one that turns a shipwreck into a tragedy. There were not enough boats. The ship carried 20 lifeboats. Lined along her upper deck, they looked like plenty. To the eye, they seemed a generous number, more than many ships of the day bothered to carry. But the eye was wrong. 20 boats, even filled to the very brim, could hold only around half the people on board. There were more than 2,200 souls aboard that night. The boats had room for roughly 1,200. The arithmetic left more than 1,000 human beings with no place to go. How could that be allowed? The answer is the same belief that runs through this whole story, the conviction that the ship herself was the lifeboat. The rules of the time counted boats by the weight of the ship, not the number of people aboard, and the thinking went that a vessel this large and this well divided would never sink quickly, if she sank at all. The boats were imagined as ferries, a way to move people calmly to a rescue ship across a flat sea. They were never meant to hold everyone at once. No one expected they would have to, and there had nearly been more of them. Early in her design, drawings had shown room for many more boats along the same deck. They were left out before she sailed, in part because a deck crowded with lifeboats looked cluttered and might unsettle the very passengers it was meant to protect. So the open space along the rail stayed open. It looked clean and uncrowded. It saved no one. So the certainty that the ship could not sink had done something quietly cruel, long before the ice ever touched her. On paper, months earlier, the matter had already been settled. More than 1,000 of the people now standing on her decks would have nowhere to go if the unthinkable happened. They had walked up the gangway past those boats without counting them. Why would anyone count the lifeboats on a ship that could not sink? This is the part of the night that should sit heaviest with us. The iceberg was chance. The flat sea was chance. But the shortage of boats was a choice. It was made in offices on dry land, by people who were sure to the point of carelessness. It is the cost of certainty. It was paid by strangers, in the cold and the dark, far out at sea. The officers on the boat deck now faced the consequence of that choice. They had perhaps an hour. They had 20 boats for more than 2,000 people. And they had a crowd that did not yet believe any of this was real. Each frightened group had to be coaxed toward the rail and into small wooden boats. The boats hung far above a black and freezing sea. There was no plan equal to this. The crew had never drilled for it, not properly, not with passengers. They would have to invent the whole thing as they went, in the cold and the rising fear, with the deck tilting slowly beneath them. And so the loading began. It began politely and slowly, and with a terrible reluctance on the part of people who could not believe they were truly in danger. The first boats would go down toward the water, carrying far fewer people than they could have saved. The reason for that is one of the quietest heartbreaks of the entire night. The order that shaped the next hour was simple and old. Women and children first. It was spoken on the boat deck and carried from officer to officer, and it became the rule by which lives were sorted in the dark. It sounds clear when you say it. On the deck of a sinking ship it was anything but. The boats hung from their ropes against the side of the hull, swaying high above a sea no one could quite see in the dark. To climb into one, a woman had to step across a gap and trust a few thin lines and the men working them. Many would not. They looked at the small boat and the long drop and the black water below, and they looked back at the warm and brightly lit ship behind them, and they chose the ship. It still felt safer. It still felt solid. So families were broken apart at the rail, gently and terribly. A husband would lift his wife and children into a boat and then step back. That stepping back is one of the hardest images of the night. A man who had every reason to live, who loved his family more than his own life, taking one pace away from the boat so that a stranger's wife and child could take his place. Some women refused to go without their husbands and had to be lifted in against their will. Others would not be parted and stayed at their men's sides, choosing the ship and whatever was coming. On one side of the deck, an officer read the order strictly, allowing only women and children into the boats and turning men away even when seats remained empty. On the other side, a different officer read it more loosely, letting men step in once the women nearby had been seated. Where you happened to be standing, on which side of the ship, quietly decided whether you lived. Children were lifted over the gap and into waiting arms. A mother passed her baby down to a stranger and then could not reach the boat herself before it was lowered away. These were not choices made with time to weigh them. They were made in seconds, in the cold, with the deck sloping underfoot and the crew calling for haste. There were small acts of grace everywhere in that hour. A man gave up his place to a woman he had never met. A stranger took a frightened child onto her lap and promised to keep it safe, with no idea whether she could keep that promise. Crewmen who knew the ship was lost worked the ropes calmly, helping others into the boats they themselves would not be allowed to enter. And there was confusion, because there is always confusion. In the dark, with the deck tilting and the rockets hissing up into the night, people made split-second choices they would carry forever. A woman stepped into a boat, and her sister did not, and they were parted for the last time over nothing more than a moment's hesitation. Families assumed they would all find places further along the deck, and some never did. The order was meant to bring fairness to something that could not be fair. There were not enough boats, and so every seat given to one person was a seat taken from another. The deck became a place of impossible arithmetic, worked out not on paper now, but in the faces of husbands and wives saying goodbye in the cold, still half believing they might see each other by morning. And then came the part that is hardest of all to forgive. The boats went down half empty. The very first boat lowered from the side of the ship could have held 65 people. It went down toward the water carrying about 28. Think about that for a moment. More than 30 empty seats dropping away into the dark, while above them 1,000 people would soon have nowhere to go. It was not the only one. Boat after boat left the side of the ship with room to spare. There were reasons, and none of them are satisfying. The crew did not fully trust the ropes and the davits to hold a boat at full load as it was lowered. They feared the weight might buckle the lines, or that a fully laden boat might bend and spill in the descent. So they sent the boats down light, meaning to fill them from lower doors once they reached the water. That plan mostly failed. The lower doors were never opened in time. The half-empty boats simply rowed away, and the passengers themselves did not want to get in. That is the quieter, sadder reason. People still did not believe the ship would sink. Why would a woman leave a deck that was warm and lit and level, where her husband stood beside her? Why climb down 70 feet of black hull into a tiny boat on a freezing sea? The danger she could see was the boat. The danger she could not see was the water rising in the dark below her feet. So she stayed, and the seat beside her went down empty, and only later from the water would she understand what that empty seat had cost. Some boats left with fewer than half their places filled. One was lowered with only a small handful of people aboard. Each empty bench was a life that might have been saved, dropping uselessly toward the sea, while the crowd on the deck grew larger and the time grew shorter. This is the cruelest arithmetic of the whole night. The boats had room for around 1,200 people. In the end, they carried only about 700. Even the few boats they had were not filled. Hundreds of people who might have lived rowed away from the ship with empty wooden benches beside them, because the warning had come too softly, and the belief in the ship had been too strong. Out on the dark water, the early boat sat and watched. The ship still blazed with light, every porthole glowing, the great hull seeming as solid and permanent as ever. From a few hundred yards away, it did not look like a ship that was dying. It looked like a small bright city floating on a black plain, impossibly calm, impossibly beautiful. But the people in those boats could see something the bright lights almost hid. The line of portholes nearest the water was slipping lower. The bow was going down, and the angle of the lit decks against the field of stars was changing, slowly, steadily, in a way that could no longer be explained away or argued with. The ship was beginning at last to tip toward the sea. On her decks, where more than 1,500 people still stood, that same slow tilt was becoming impossible to ignore. The time for disbelief was running out. Through all of it, across the tilting deck and the rising fear, there was music. The ship carried a small band of musicians, 8 men who played for the passengers during the crossing. On an ordinary evening, they would have finished their work by now and gone to their cabins. On this night, they did something else. They gathered together, and they took up their instruments, and they began to play in the first-class entrance near the boat deck, where the crowd was thickest and the fog was beginning to rise. Their leader was a violinist named Wallace Hartley. He was a quiet and well-liked man, recently engaged to be married, with every reason to want to live. No one ordered the band to play. There was no rule that said the musicians must stay at their posts while the ship went down. They chose it. They understood, better than most of the passengers around them, exactly what was happening. And they decided that the most useful thing they could offer was not a seat in a boat, but a steadiness in the air. So they played. They played lively tunes at first, the kind of cheerful ragtime the passengers had danced to during the voyage. Music meant to hold back panic and to keep the crowd from breaking. The musicians stood without coats in the cold, their fingers stiffening on the strings. The deck sloped under their feet. They were not trained for any of this. They were ordinary working men who played for their living, and yet they stayed at it long after the last cheerful tune would have been forgiven. As the deck tilted further and the boats pulled away, the music did not stop. It is one of the most remembered details of the entire night, passed down by survivor after survivor who heard it drifting across the water as they rowed away. The band kept playing. We do not know with certainty what their final piece was. Some who survived remembered a slow and solemn hymn near the end, a melody about drawing nearer to something greater than ourselves in the moment of greatest need. Others remembered a quiet waltz. The records, like so much from that night, do not fully agree. What every account shares is the simple, almost unbearable fact that the music continued long after there was any hope left. Picture it from one of the boats, low on the black water, a few 100 yards out. The great ship glitters in the dark, tilting now at an angle no one can mistake. And across the still air, thin and clear, comes the sound of violins. It is the most human sound imaginable in the most inhuman of places. It speaks to everyone still on board and everyone already in the boats. Whatever else is being lost tonight, something in these people will not be surrendered to the cold. None of the musicians survived. Every one of the 8 was lost. They played until they could no longer stand on the sloping deck. And then the music finally stopped, and there was only the noise of the crowd and the sea. They were not the only ones who chose, in those last minutes, how they would meet what was coming. All over the ship, men and women were making quiet decisions about how to spend the time they had left. Some of the people aboard could have taken a place in a boat and chose not to. Their stories have lasted because of what those choices reveal about who a person becomes when the time is short and there is nothing left to gain. There was an elderly couple who had been married for more than 40 years. He was a wealthy merchant, well known in New York, the owner of a great store. When the boats were being loaded, his wife was offered a seat, and the men around them urged her to take it. She would not. She had spent her whole adult life beside this man, and she would not begin to live without him now. "Where you go," she told him, "I go." They were last seen sitting together on the deck, quietly, waiting. They did not try for a boat again. There was a famous and very rich man traveling with his valet. When he understood that the ship was lost, he did not push toward the boats. Instead, he returned to his cabin with his manservant and changed out of his warm clothes into full evening dress. If he was going to die, he meant to die as he had lived. He sent a message with a steward for his wife, should the steward survive. "Tell her," he said, "that we dressed in our best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen." Then he settled into a deck chair to wait. Far below, in the heat and the noise, the engineers stayed at their posts. There were dozens of them. Their work was the electricity, the pumps, the lights that kept the ship from falling into total darkness. Every one of them knew the ship was sinking. Not one of them came up. They stayed below the waterline, in the rising heat and the rising water, working the machinery so that the lights above would keep burning and the wireless would keep calling for help. Every single engineer was lost. The lights they fed with their lives stayed on almost until the very end. Their names are mostly forgotten now. They were greasers and electricians and stokers, men whose work no passenger had ever seen or thought about. In the end, they bought a little more time for everyone above, and they bought it with the last hours of their own lives. The ship's designer, the man who had read her death in the flooding compartments, was seen in the first-class smoking room. He had given up. He stood there alone, staring at a painting on the wall. His lifebelt was cast aside. He was lost in the knowledge that the thing he had built was about to take so many people down with it. And the captain was an old and respected man on what was meant to be his final voyage before retirement. He moved through the chaos, doing what he could. Then, near the end, he released his crew from their duty. Every man for himself, he told them. It was no longer in anyone's power to save the ship, or most of the people on it. These were not characters in a story. They were real people making real choices in the last hour of their lives, and the hour was almost gone. The deck beneath them was tilting now toward the black water, and the bow was sliding under, and the end, when it came, would come fast. By now, the tilt of the deck had become the whole world. What had been a level floor an hour before was now a slope, and the slope was steepening, and every person still aboard could feel it in the soles of their feet and in the pull on their legs as they climbed. The last of the boats were gone. There was nothing left to load. The people who remained, more than 1,500 of them, began to move the only way the ship now allowed. They moved aft, away from the bow that was sliding under, climbing toward the stern that was lifting slowly into the night. The crowd gathered at the high end of the ship. They pressed together and held the rails and held each other. They watched the dark water creep up the deck toward them. The lights were still burning. That is one of the details survivors could never forget. The engineers below were still feeding the machinery, and so the ship blazed with light, even as her bow went under, every porthole glowing, the long string of deck lamps shining down on water that should never have been touching them. From the boats it was a sight of terrible beauty. A great lit ship, standing slowly on end, lifting her stern against a sky thick with stars. On the deck there was no longer any pretending. The sounds changed in those final minutes. From below came a deep groaning and a series of heavy crashes as everything inside the ship that was not fixed in place began to break loose and slide. Engines tore from their mountings. Furniture and china and pianos, the great weight of a floating town, all of it crashed forward and down into the flooding bow. The roar of it was a sound survivors said they would hear for the rest of their lives. People held on. Some prayed aloud. Some stood in silence. Some climbed higher, toward the very stern rail, as though a few more feet of height could be bought against what was coming. Couples held hands. Strangers gripped the same railing. A few, unable to bear the waiting, slipped or jumped into the freezing sea, and the cold took the breath from them at once. The deck was so steep now that to stand was to climb. People held railings that had been level an hour before and were now closer to walls. Deck chairs slid past them and vanished over the edge into the black water below. The whole familiar world was tilting onto its end, and there was nowhere left to go but up. And still, somewhere in those last minutes, the band could be heard, and the lights still shone, and the stern still climbed. The ship was fighting her own weight now. The flooded bow dragged her down, and the dry stern lifted up. The whole long hull strained against forces it was never built to bear. Then the strain became too great. Down near the waterline, where the bright decks met the Black Sea, the ship began to come apart. The lights flickered once. They dimmed. And every person on that deck, and every person watching from the boats, understood that the last moment had arrived. The lights blazed a final time, a long string of gold against the black water, and then they went out, all of them, at once. After days of light and warmth, after an hour of frantic effort under those steady lamps, the ship fell suddenly into total darkness. The engineers who had kept the power alive were gone, or overwhelmed at last, and with them went the last of the bright floating town. What remained was only a vast black shape against the stars, tilted at an impossible angle, and the sound. The sound is what the survivors remembered most. As the stern rose higher and higher, the strain on the hull reached a point steel could not hold. With a noise that witnesses compared to the breaking of something far larger than a ship, the great vessel tore in two near the surface. The bow, already flooded and heavy, broke away and began its long fall toward the bottom. The stern settled back for a moment, almost level. It was as if the ship had been granted one last pause. It did not last. The sea poured into the broken end of the stern, and it too began to rise, tilting up once more, higher than before, until it stood nearly straight up against the night. Hundreds of people still clung to it. They held the rails and the deck fittings as the world turned vertical beneath them, as the familiar boards became a cliff, as the stars wheeled overhead and the black water waited below. And then the stern went down, not in a sudden plunge, but in a slow and dreadful slide, gathering speed, sinking into the sea until the rails went under, and the highest point went under, and the place where more than 1,000 people had been standing a moment before was simply gone. The water closed over it. The stars came back to the surface of the sea, and where the largest ship in the world had been, there was nothing but dark water and a faint disturbance settling slowly into calm. From the boats a few hundred yards away, the survivors watched it happen. Many could not quite believe their own eyes. The ship that could not sink had sunk in front of them in a little over 2.5 hours from the moment the ice touched her. The bow was already falling through more than 2 miles of black water toward a bottom no human being would see for over 70 years. For a strange and terrible moment after the ship vanished, there was almost silence. The great groaning and crashing had stopped. The sea was flat again. The stars were bright. It was as if the ocean had smoothed itself over and erased what had just occurred. But the silence did not hold. Out of the dark water where the ship had been, a sound began to rise. It came from the hundreds of people the boats had left behind, and it was unlike anything those who heard it had ever known. More than 1,000 people were now in the water. Not under it. In it. Floating in their lifebelts across the dark sea where the ship had been, spread out over the cold under the stars. The water that night was about 28 degrees by the old Fahrenheit scale, colder than freezing, kept liquid only by the salt in it. A human body does not last long in water like that, but it does not die at once either, and that is the source of the sound. For a time, a long and unbearable time, the people in the water were alive and aware and calling out. Survivors in the boats described it in almost the same words, again and again, across all the years that followed. They said it was a great wail, a single enormous cry made of hundreds of separate voices, rolling across the water out of the dark. Some compared it to the sound of a crowd at a distant stadium. Others could find nothing to compare it to at all. It was the sound of more than 1,000 people in the water, in the cold, calling for the help that almost none of them would receive. The lifebelts held them up, faces to the stars, but the cold was already inside them. A person could call out for a while. Then the calling would weaken. The water took the strength from arms and from voices alike, and in that flat, black sea, there was nothing at all to hold on to. And here is the part that has haunted the world ever since. The boats did not come back. Most of them were only half full. There was room, real room, on the wooden benches, for many of the people now crying out in the dark. But the people in the boats were afraid. They feared that if they rowed back toward the mass of swimmers, the desperate hands would seize the sides and pull the boats over and drown everyone. So most of the boats stayed where they were, a few hundred yards off, and listened. Imagine sitting in one of those boats. The ship is gone. The night is perfectly clear and bitterly cold. The stars are reflected in the flat black sea, and across that water comes the sound of the dying. Your fellow passengers, perhaps your own husband or father among them, and you sit still in a boat with empty seats beside you, too frightened to row toward them. That is a weight some of the survivors carried in silence for the rest of their lives. Only one boat truly turned back. An officer in command of one of the boats gathered several others together, moved his passengers into them to make room, and rowed his nearly empty boat into the field of the dead and the dying to search for anyone still alive. By the time he reached the place, the great cry had already begun to fade. He found only a handful of people still living among the many who were not. A few souls pulled from the water at the very edge of the coal's reach. The rest he was too late for. He was too late because the sound does not last. It rose and it filled the night, and then, voice by voice, it began to grow quieter. The fading was not mercy, though in the end it became one. It was the cold doing its slow and certain work. Water that close to freezing pulls the heat from a human body with terrible speed. The lifebelts kept the people afloat. They could not keep them warm. One by one, out there in the dark, the swimmers grew quiet. Not because they were rescued, because the cold reached into them and stilled the calling, and then stilled the rest. Most of the people who died that night did not drown. That is one of the quieter truths of the disaster. They floated in their lifebelts, heads above the surface, held up by the very devices meant to save them, and the water around them simply took their warmth until there was none left to take. The sea did not have to pull them under. It only had to wait, and it had all the patience in the world. The lifebelts that had failed to save them now held them in place. A field of still shapes spread across the dark. The sea did not stir. The stars did not change. Whatever warmth a human body carries had passed quietly out of them into the water, and the water gave nothing back. So the great cry that had filled the night thinned and broke into scattered voices, and then into single voices, and then into nothing. It took perhaps half an hour. To the people in the boats listening in the dark, that half hour had no end. They were unable or unwilling to go back. They heard the sound of more than 1,000 lives going out, slowly, over the flat water beneath the indifferent stars. And then it was quiet, truly quiet, in a way the night had not been, since the ice first touched the hull. No engines, no music, no crowd, no calling. Only the small sounds of the boats themselves, the creak of an oar, the lap of water against wood, and the breathing of the living. The sea had closed over everything and gone smooth and black and still, as though none of it had ever happened. The survivors sat in their boats under that enormous sky and waited for a dawn they were not sure would come. They were scattered across miles of dark water in 20 small boats, most only partly full. Many were in their nightclothes. Children cried and were hushed. Some of the living did not yet know that the husband or the father or the brother they had been parted from at the rail was already gone, out there in the silence, beyond any help. It is hard to hold the scale of it. In a little over 2.5 hours, a floating town of more than 2,000 people had become a scatter of small boats, holding around 700. More than 1,500 human beings were lost between the moment the ice touched the side and the moment the stars came back to the surface of the sea. Most of them died, not in the great sinking, but afterward, quietly in the cold, within reach of boats that did not come. The night was not over. The survivors still had to live through the rest of it, hour by freezing hour, until something appeared on the horizon. And whether anything would appear at all was, for a long and terrible while, entirely unknown. Rescue, when it came from far away. A ship called the Carpathia had heard the wireless calls more than 50 miles off and turned at once toward them. She drove her engines harder than they were built to go, racing through the same ice fields in the dark, at terrible risk to herself. She could not arrive in time to save the people in the water. She could only hurry toward the boats, and hope there would be someone left to lift from them. There is a harder fact, close beside this one. Another ship had been much nearer, perhaps only a handful of miles away, close enough that some in the boats believed they could see her lights on the horizon. Rockets had been fired up from the sinking ship, white bursts climbing into the night, the old and clear signal of a vessel in distress. That nearer ship saw the rockets and did not understand them and did not come. Her wireless had been switched off for the night. The lights the survivors watched so desperately never moved closer. By the time that ship grasped what had happened, the morning was already over. So it was the Carpathia, racing from far off, that reached them as the sky began to grey. The survivors in the boat saw her lights at last, low on the horizon, and then her shape, and they understood that they would live. Some wept, some could not make a sound. They had been on the open sea in small boats for hours, in the killing cold, and now a ship was coming for them across the dawn. As the light grew, the survivors saw for the first time the place they had been floating in all night. The sea was full of ice. Great pale mountains of it stood all around them in the pink and silver light, beautiful and enormous. One of them surely the one that had opened the ship. The boats had been drifting among them in the dark for hours, without ever seeing them, and the sea was full of other things: deck chairs, pieces of wood, cork, a child's toy, the scattered belongings of a floating town drifting on the flat water, and among the wreckage, here and there, lay the still forms of those who had died in the cold and not gone under. They were held up by their lifebelts, faces to the brightening sky. The boats moved through them quietly toward the rescue ship. There was nothing anyone could do for them now but look and remember. One by one, the boats reached the Carpathia. The survivors were lifted aboard in slings and rope chairs, frozen and silent, many barely able to stand. Wives searched the decks for husbands who were not there. Children were handed up into the arms of strangers. On her decks, blankets were brought out, and hot drinks, and quiet words from strangers. Survivors stood at the rail and looked back at the field of ice and floating wreckage. Some were searching the water still, hoping against everything that one more boat might appear out of the morning. None did. And when the last boat was emptied and the last survivor counted, the small rescue ship turned her bow toward New York, carrying around 700 people, away from the place where more than 1,500 had been lost. Behind her, the sea closed over and went calm, and gave no sign at all of what it had taken in the night. More than 100 years have passed since that calm and starlit night. The ship herself was found at last. She lies broken in 2 pieces on the floor of the ocean, more than 2 miles down. The dark there is cold and silent, and it has never known the sun. We have mapped her, we have lit her with our cameras, and counted her rivets, and argued again over how she died. In almost every way, the wreck has given up its secrets, but the people have not, and they never will. That is the thing the night keeps. We know the numbers. We know who lived and who was lost. We know the broad shape of those last 2.5 hours, the boats and the band and the cold, but we do not know, and we cannot ever know, the things that matter most. We do not know what passed between the old couple as they sat together on the deck and chose not to be parted. We do not know what a mother whispered to her child in a half-empty boat as the ship's lights slid under the water. We do not know the last private thought of the man in his evening clothes, or the engineer at his post in the rising water, or any of the more than 1,500 who went into the dark. Those moments belong to them. They happened in the cold and the darkness, beyond the reach of any record, and they went down with the people who lived them. The sea took them and kept them, and it will not give them back. No expedition will ever recover them. No camera will ever light them. They are gone, completely into the place where only the people themselves ever were. And perhaps that is right. Perhaps some things are not meant to be recovered. We are a species that wants to know everything, to map every flaw and open every door. And most of the time, that hunger serves us well. But there is a kind of knowing that would be a theft. The final thoughts of the dying, the last words between people who loved each other at the edge of the end. These are not data to be retrieved. They are the most human things there are, and they are private, and the dark keeps them safe. So when we think of that night, we should not only count what was lost, we should honor what is hidden. The calm sea, the field of stars, the small boats scattered on the black water, and somewhere beneath all of it, held forever out of reach, the true and unrecorded last hours of more than 2,000 human lives. The ship is on the bottom now, quiet in the cold she fell into. Above her, the same ocean lies flat and dark on calm nights, just as it did then, keeping its silence. The people are gone. Their last moments are theirs alone, and the sea that took them holds them still, gently, in a darkness that gives nothing.